Her parents sold the pregnant teen for bread, but the Amish man received a goddess. The winter wind howls across a dying town. A starving father shoves his daughter onto the auction block of life and hands her away for nothing more than a sack of flour. She thinks her fate is sealed, until a silent farmer lifts her into his wagon, not with chains, but with prayer. But in the shadows, railroad men whisper, and the father schemes to reclaim her because the child she carries holds power neither of them yet understands. And as snow buries the plains, danger comes knocking on their cabin door. She was sold like property, yet treated like treasure. He swore never to fight again, yet the night may force his hand. When greed, faith, and blood collide under one roof, will this young mother be torn away once more, or will she rise as the goddess she was never meant to be? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The winter wind whips across the prairie, bitter and sharp as a blade. Folk from the small town huddle together on the boardwalk, breath rising in white puffs, watching the scene unfold before the general store. Their faces are grim, but none step forward to intervene. Amos Taylor's grip is iron tight on his daughter's arm as he practically drags her up the wooden steps. Lydia stumbles, her thick wool skirt catching on the rough boards. Her free hand instinctively moves to protect her swollen belly, hidden beneath layers of fabric. The whispers follow her like shadows. "Ain't right," someone mutters, but the words are lost to the howling wind. Xavier Hochstetler stands straight-backed in his plain black coat, his broad-brimmed hat casting shadows across his weathered face. His eyes, deep-set and solemn, take in Lydia's trembling form and her father's desperate anger without judgment. The leather of his boots creaks as he shifts his waiting. "Well?" Amos demands, his voice cracking like a whip. "We had words yesterday. You said you'd do it." His gaunt face is flushed with more than just the cold, the sour smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes. Xavier nods once, deliberate as scripture. "I will honor our agreement." His words are soft but carry weight, spoken in the measured cadence of his Pennsylvania Dutch upbringing. He turns and retrieves a burlap sack from his wagon, along with a cloth-wrapped bundle that releases the warm, yeasty scent of fresh-baked bread. Lydia's father snatches them both, checking the contents with shaking hands. "Flour's good," he grudgingly admits. "Bread too." His grip on Lydia's arm loosens just slightly. The townsfolk watch in uncomfortable silence as this transaction unfolds. Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, dabs at her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Tom Wheeler spits into the dirt and turns away, but still, no one speaks up. Xavier steps forward, his movements careful and measured. He offers his arm to Lydia with simple dignity, as if this were nothing more unusual than helping a lady down from a carriage. "Miss Taylor," he says quietly, "if you would come with me." Lydia's eyes dart between her father and the strange quiet man before her. Tears freeze on her cheeks as she realizes this is truly happening. She is being traded away like a head of cattle, all for a sack of flour and some loaves of bread. Her hands clutch her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to hold herself together. The moment stretches like pulled taffy until finally, with no other choice before her, Lydia releases her father's arm and places her trembling hand on Xavier's offered elbow. The rough wool of his coat is solid and warm beneath her fingers. "Got 5 other mouths to feed," Amos announces to no one in particular, his voice loud and defensive in the winter air. "Can't keep a ruined girl. You'll see I'm right." He doesn't look at his daughter as he turns away, clutching his payment to his chest. Xavier guides Lydia down the steps with surprising gentleness, supporting her weight as she navigates the icy boards. His wagon stands ready, the 2 draft horses stamping patiently in their harness. Steam rises from their broad backs in the cold December morning. The townsfolk begin to disperse, shaking their heads and whispering among themselves. Some make the sign of the cross. Others mutter prayers. But they all turn away, returning to their warm homes and their own concerns, leaving Lydia to her fate. Xavier helps her up onto the wagon seat, making sure she's settled before climbing up beside her. He tucks a heavy quilt around her legs without a word, his actions speaking of simple kindness rather than ownership. Still, Lydia shrinks away from his touch, fighting back sobs that threaten to tear her apart. The sun is already sinking toward the horizon when Xavier finally clicks to his horses. The wagon wheels crunch through the snow as they leave the town behind, heading out onto the open prairie. Lydia keeps her face turned away, letting her tears fall silently, as the only home she's ever known grows smaller in the distance. Not once does Xavier try to break the silence between them. He simply drives on, his presence beside her, as steady as the horizon ahead. The only sounds are the creaking of the wagon, the soft nicker of the horses, and the endless keening of the winter wind across the plains. The wagon creaked to a halt as darkness settled over the prairie. Through the swirling snow, Lydia made out the shape of a modest cabin, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. A barn loomed nearby, its weathered boards barely visible in the gathering storm. Xavier climbed down first, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He reached up to help Lydia, but she flinched away, struggling down on her own despite her condition. Her legs were stiff from the cold ride, and she stumbled slightly. Without comment, Xavier steadied her with a gentle hand at her elbow, then led the way to the cabin's door. The interior was plain but tidy, with simple furniture crafted from solid oak. Oil lamps cast a gentle glow across whitewashed walls. A black iron wood stove radiated blessed heat from one corner, and the air held the lingering aroma of cooking. Lydia stood awkwardly just inside the door, clutching her thin shawl around her shoulders. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for Xavier to show his true nature. Surely the kindness was just for show, just until they were alone. But Xavier simply hung his hat and coat on pegs by the door, then moved to the stove where a pot simmered. "You must be hungry," he said quietly, his words barely louder than the crackling fire. She watched in wary silence as he ladled thick beef stew into 2 bowls and cut generous slices from a fresh loaf of bread. He set these on the small table, then pulled out a chair for her. When she didn't move, he simply said, "Please, eat while it's warm." The rich smell of the stew made her stomach clench with hunger. Slowly, she approached the table and perched on the edge of the chair, ready to flee. Xavier sat across from her and bowed his head in silent prayer before beginning his meal. Lydia hadn't eaten since morning. Despite her fear, she couldn't resist the hot food before her. The stew was hearty with chunks of beef and vegetables, and the bread was still fresh enough to release steam when broken. She ate quickly, expecting the meal to be snatched away at any moment. Throughout the meal, Xavier spoke little. He only asked if she wanted more bread, which she declined with a quick shake of her head. When they finished, he cleared the bowls without comment. "I'll show you where you can sleep," he said, lifting one of the oil lamps. Lydia's throat tightened with fear as she followed him down a short hallway to a small bedroom. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt. A rocking chair sat in one corner beneath a window, and a small dresser stood against the wall. Everything spoke of feminine touches now faded. A dried flower arrangement, delicate curtains, a carved wooden brush on the dresser. "This was my wife's room," Xavier said softly, setting the lamp on the dresser. "Sarah's been gone 3 years now. The bedding is fresh." He paused, then added, "The door has a lock. You can use it if it brings you peace." Lydia stood frozen in the center of the room, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Xavier merely took a step back toward the hallway. Instead of leaving, though, he folded his large hands and began to pray aloud. "Lord," he said, his deep voice gentle, "thank you for this day, and for those you have entrusted to my care. Watch over this household through the night. Guide us in your wisdom and grace. Amen." With that, he nodded once and left, closing the door behind him. Lydia stood staring at the door for a long moment before her trembling legs carried her to the rocking chair. She sank into it, trying to make sense of this strange man and his unexpected kindness. Outside, the storm grew fiercer. Snow pelted against the window glass, and wind moaned around the cabin's corners. The sound of the wood stoves, steady crackling, drifted through the walls, along with the occasional creak of floorboards, as Xavier moved about in the other room. Lydia rocked slowly, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Her father's cold eyes and cruel words haunted her thoughts. The memory of his grip on her arm, the way he'd traded her away for mere flour and bread, brought fresh tears to her eyes. How could such cruelty be followed by such unexpected gentleness? The night stretched endlessly. Though exhaustion weighed heavily on her, sleep remained elusive. She rocked and listened to the storm, jumping at every sound, expecting at any moment to hear heavy footsteps approaching her door. But the only sounds were the wind, the fire, and the gentle creaking of her chair. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the window, Lydia's eyes finally grew too heavy to keep open. Still in the rocking chair, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, wrapped in the strange comfort of a room where kindness seemed to linger in every corner. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's frost-etched windows, painting golden squares on the wooden floor. The crunch of boots in snow and the rhythmic thud of an axe had woken Lydia. She crept to the window, her shawl pulled tight, and watched Xavier carrying armloads of split wood to stack by the cabin's door. The morning air held a sharp bite when Lydia finally ventured out of her room. The cabin's main room was empty, but a fire already crackled in the wood stove, and she could smell coffee. A bowl of steaming porridge sat waiting on the table, alongside a cup of the dark brew. Through the window, she saw Xavier making his way to the barn, his broad shoulders hunched against the cold. His steady movements showed no hint of hurry or anger, just the calm purpose of a man attending to his daily tasks. When he returned, snow dusting his plain dark coat, he nodded to her. "If you're willing," he said quietly, "I can show you how we grind the corn here." He paused, then added, "Only if you feel strong enough." Lydia's hands instinctively went to her swollen belly. For months, her father had treated her like a burden, useless, and marked by shame. The idea of being helpful, of having purpose, tugged at something deep inside her. She nodded slightly, and Xavier led her to where a hand-cranked mill sat mounted to a sturdy table. He demonstrated the motion needed, his large hands turning the handle with practiced ease. The corn kernels fed slowly between the grinding stones, emerging as fine meal. "The steady rhythm matters more than speed," he explained, stepping back. "Would you like to try?" Lydia stepped forward hesitantly. The handle felt smooth beneath her palms, worn by years of use. She began to turn it, finding comfort in the simple, repetitive motion. The soft grinding sound filled the kitchen, somehow soothing in its constancy. Throughout the day, Xavier moved through his tasks with quiet efficiency. He showed her where he kept the livestock feed, how he checked the harnesses for wear, the proper way to bank the wood stove's fire to last through the night. He never demanded her help, only offered to teach. When dusk approached, Xavier lit the oil lamps. He settled into a worn armchair with a well-used Bible, its leather cover soft with age. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark beard, as he read silently, his lips moving slightly with the words. Supper was simple, bread and soup, eaten in comfortable silence. Lydia found herself stealing glances at her strange protector, searching for signs of the cruelty she had expected. But his movements remained gentle, his eyes kind when they met hers. After the meal, Xavier simply bid her good night and retired to his room off the kitchen. Lydia returned to her own room, closing the door softly behind her. The lock remained unused, though her fingers had traced its smooth metal more than once during the day. The rocking chair welcomed her like an old friend. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling around the cabin's corners and rattling the window glass. Lydia placed both hands on her rounded belly, feeling the flutter of movement within. "Hold on, little one," she whispered, rocking slowly. "Just hold on." The child stirred again, as if in answer. Her thoughts drifted to yesterday morning, to her father's bloodshot eyes and trembling hands as he practically shoved her at Xavier. The memory of his voice, "Take her or don't, but I've no use for damaged goods," still cut deep. He had traded his own daughter for mere flour and bread, never looking back as the wagon pulled away. Yet somehow that terrible moment had led her here, to this quiet cabin with its steady rhythms and unexpected peace. Xavier asked nothing of her, demanded nothing, only offered shelter and simple kindness. Was this providence at work? Her mother had always spoken of God's mysterious ways, how blessing could bloom from the darkest soil. The wind moaned louder, driving snow against the window pane. But inside, the wood stove's warmth held firm, and the familiar creak of the rocking chair soothed her worried mind. For the first time since discovering her condition, Lydia felt something close to hope flutter in her chest, fragile as a bird's wing, but present all the same. She rocked slowly, listening to the storm's fury outside while savoring the simple safety of these four walls. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight at least, she and her unborn child had found shelter in this unexpected harbor. The next 3 days settled into a gentle rhythm at Xavier's farm. Each morning, Lydia woke to the familiar sounds of him stoking the wood stove and feeding the livestock. The routine brought her an unexpected peace, grinding corn, helping prepare simple meals, and watching the snow drift against the windows while she mended Xavier's work shirts. During meals, they shared comfortable silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the constant hiss of the wood stove. Xavier never pressed her to speak, seeming to understand her need for quiet. His presence was steady as the land itself, and slowly, Lydia felt her shoulders unknot, her breathing ease. On the evening of the third day, just as they finished their supper of beans and cornbread, heavy boots stomped on the porch outside. A sharp knock followed. Xavier rose carefully, setting his Bible aside. When he opened the door, cold air rushed in along with Tom Miller, one of the closer neighbors who lived 2 miles east. "Evening, Xavier," Tom said, stamping snow from his boots. His face was red from the bitter wind, his expression troubled. "Need a word, if you can. Spare it." Xavier nodded, gesturing to a chair. Lydia began gathering the dishes, but Tom's next words froze her in place. "It's about her father," Tom said quietly, glancing at Lydia. "He's been at McGregor's saloon since noon, drunk and running his mouth something fierce." Lydia's hands trembled so hard she had to set down the bowl she was holding. Xavier remained still, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that some railroad men are mighty interested in her situation." Tom twisted his hat in his hands. "Says they figure having a child of mixed heritage might help them negotiate better with both settlers and tribal folk about land rights. They're offering him real money, Xavier." The only sound was the pop and hiss of the wood stove. Xavier's fingers tightened on his Bible, knuckles white against the worn leather cover, but his voice stayed steady. "Thank you for bringing word, Tom." After Tom left, the cabin felt colder despite the blazing fire. Lydia stood rigid by the table, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Her father wasn't finished with her. He would try to take her back, to sell her child to men who would use its very blood as a bargaining chip. "Sit," Xavier said gently, pulling out a chair. "You need rest." Lydia sank down, one hand pressed protectively over her belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the weight of truth pressed against her chest. "I should tell you," she whispered, her voice breaking, "about the baby's father." Xavier settled into the chair across from her, his presence solid and patient as always. The lamplight cast soft shadows across his face as he waited. "His name was Running Deer," Lydia said, the cherished name catching in her throat. "He was the son of Chief Tall Elk of the Southern Cheyenne." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "We met when I was gathering herbs near the creek last spring. He was kind and gentle, nothing like what my father said about his people." The words tumbled out then, like water through a broken dam. How Running Deer taught her the names of plants in his language, showed her how to read weather in the clouds. How they met in secret through the summer, sharing dreams of a future where such love wouldn't need hiding. How soldiers shot him dead in a senseless skirmish that autumn, before she could tell him about their child. "My father was furious when he discovered I was with child," she finished, her voice hollow. "Said I'd shamed him. That's when he started drinking harder, talking about selling our land to the railroad men." Xavier had listened without interruption, his eyes grave and kind. Now he spoke, his deep voice gentle as a father's. "The truth of this child's heritage does not lessen its worth in God's eyes, Lydia. Every soul carries his breath, no matter the vessel." Fresh tears spilled at his words. For months, she had carried not only her grief for Running Deer, but fear that others would view their child as somehow less. Yet here sat this quiet man of faith, offering acceptance without hesitation. The wind keened outside, rattling the window panes. Lydia shivered, remembering her father's hard eyes, imagining railroad men's calculating stares. "What if he tries to take me back?" she whispered. "You are safe here," Xavier said firmly, his usual quiet manner hardened to steel. "I gave my word to protect those in my care, and I mean to keep it." Dawn broke sharp and cold over Xavier's farm. The crunch of axe against wood drew Lydia from her sleep. Through frosted window panes, she watched Xavier's steady rhythm as he split logs, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. His movements were methodical, each strike precise and purposeful. The growing woodpile spoke of preparation rather than routine. When Lydia stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning chill, Xavier paused in his work. Sweat had frozen on his beard, despite the cold, and his eyes held a watchful calm. "We must be ready," he said simply, setting another log on the chopping block. "More firewood than usual. Extra provisions. Keep careful watch." The axe fell, splitting the wood with a clean crack. "These are uncertain times." Lydia nodded, understanding the unspoken concern behind his words. Her father's threats hung in the air like storm clouds. "I want to help," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The flour bin needs filling," Xavier replied, not pausing in his work. "Bread would be welcome." In the warmth of the kitchen, Lydia measured flour with trembling hands. The familiar motions of kneading dough helped steady her nerves, though her thoughts wandered to dark possibilities. The steady thump of Xavier's axe outside provided an anchor, reminding her she wasn't alone. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, hoofbeats approached the cabin. Xavier appeared at the door, axe in hand, but relaxed when he recognized the rider, Reverend Thompson, the circuit preacher who traveled between scattered homesteads. "God's peace to this house," the Reverend called out, dismounting stiffly. He was a thin man with kind eyes, his black coat dusted with snow. Xavier welcomed him inside, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The Reverend warmed his hands by the stove, while Lydia poured coffee into tin cups. "I heard in town about your situation, child," Reverend Thompson said gently. "I came to offer prayers, if you'll accept them." Lydia's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She nodded, unable to speak. The Reverend's weathered hands reached for hers, his touch grandfatherly and warm. "Every soul born into this world carries God's purpose," he said, his voice rich with conviction. "Your child is no different. The Lord knows the plans He has for this little one, plans for hope and a future, not for harm." Tears slid down Lydia's cheeks as the Reverend prayed, his words washing over her like healing balm. For the first time since learning of her pregnancy, she felt something beyond fear when thinking of her child's future, a flutter of hope, fragile as a bird's wing. After the Reverend departed, Lydia and Xavier sat down to their evening meal. The silence between them felt different now, softened by shared experience. Steam rose from their bowls as snow began falling outside, thick flakes visible in the lamplight. "My wife, Rebecca," Xavier said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear. "She loved winter evenings like this. Said the snow made the world feel clean and new." Lydia looked up, surprised by this voluntary sharing of memory. Xavier's eyes were distant, seeing something beyond the cabin walls. "She died bringing our son into the world," he continued. "Neither survived the birth." His hands, strong from years of farming, cradled his coffee cup as if it might break. "For a long time, my faith felt like ashes in my mouth. I questioned God's purpose in such suffering." "What changed?" Lydia asked softly. "Time, prayer." Xavier's gaze returned to the present, meeting hers. "Learning that sometimes God's mercy comes disguised as ordinary moments. A warm fire, daily bread, the chance to help someone in need." Lydia understood then that Xavier's gentleness toward her wasn't born of pity or obligation. It came from a deep well of lived pain, of faith tested and reformed in sorrow's forge. His quiet strength wasn't the absence of struggle, but its transformation into something useful and kind. The evening deepened around them as they continued talking, sharing more words than in all the days previous. Lydia spoke of her mother's death when she was young, how her father changed afterward. Xavier described learning farming from his grandfather, the satisfaction of working land with patience and care. Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the world in hushed white. Inside the cabin, something new was taking root, a trust built on shared confidences and recognized pain, growing stronger with each honest word. Over the next few days, a gentle routine settled over Xavier's farmstead. Lydia found purpose in small tasks, though her growing belly made some work challenging. She discovered torn shirts in Xavier's dresser and mended them without being asked, her neat stitches closing holes and reinforcing worn seams. "You needn't trouble yourself," Xavier said when he found her sewing by the window, winter sunlight catching the silver needle as it dipped and rose. "I want to help," Lydia replied, her voice stronger than in previous days. These hands need work to keep worry at bay. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. He'd noticed how she seemed more settled when busy, how purpose smoothed the anxiety from her features. Despite his protests, Lydia insisted on carrying kindling for the stove. "The baby's not due for months yet," she said firmly. "And I'm stronger than I look." She proved it by helping with the chickens too, scattering feed while talking softly to the pecking hens. Their clucking and scratching reminded her of happier days on her family's farm, before drought and desperation changed everything. The evenings brought a different kind of peace. After supper, Xavier would settle into his chair by the fire, worn Bible in hand. His voice, steady and deep, filled the cabin with ancient words of comfort as he read from the Psalms. Lydia found herself looking forward to these quiet moments, when the day's work was done, and winter's chill was held at bay by the crackling stove. One such evening, as Xavier finished reading Psalm 23, Lydia surprised herself by humming softly. The melody rose unbidden, a lullaby her mother used to sing, about God watching over sleeping children. Before she could stop herself, words joined the tune, her voice trembling but sweet in the lamplight. "Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee, all through the night. Guardian angels God will send thee, all through the night." She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. But when she glanced at Xavier, she saw moisture in his eyes. He sat very still, Bible open on his lap, as if afraid any movement might break the spell her song had cast. "Your mother taught you that?" he asked softly. Lydia nodded, touching her throat, where the melody still seemed to linger. She sang it every night, until the fever took her. The memory ached, but sharing it felt right somehow. A sharp knock at the door startled them both. Xavier rose quickly, his expression shifting from tender to vigilant. Through the window, they could see a rider on horseback, stamping his feet against the cold. "Telegraph for the railroad office," the rider called out, his voice muffled by his scarf. "Got misrouted to the wrong township. Station master wondered if you'd pass it along next time you're in town." Xavier accepted the envelope, giving the rider a few coins for his trouble. After the hoofbeats faded into the night, he studied the telegram's contents, his brow furrowing as he read. Lydia watched his face, noting the slight tightening around his eyes. "Is something wrong?" Xavier carefully refolded the paper, tucking it into his Bible. "Just business matters," he said evenly, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "Nothing for you to worry about." Later that night, after Lydia had gone to bed, Xavier read the telegram again by lamplight. The railroad agent's plan to meet with her father in exactly 1 week's time. The message mentioned arrangements and compensation, cold words that suggested darker purposes. Xavier's hands tightened on the paper, but he forced them to relax. Getting angry wouldn't help anyone. The next evening, instead of reading from the Psalms, Xavier taught Lydia how to pray. He showed her how to kneel beside her bed, hands folded not in desperate pleading but in peaceful surrender. "Prayer isn't about convincing God to do what we want," he explained gently. "It's about finding peace in knowing He holds all things in His hands." Lydia followed his example, her knees pressing into the rough floorboards. "Even the hard things," she whispered. "The scary things." "Especially those," Xavier answered. "We pray not because we know the path ahead, but because we trust the one who does." Together they knelt in the quiet cabin, their prayers mingling with the winter wind outside. Lydia found herself relaxing into the familiar cadence of Xavier's voice, letting his steadfast faith shore up her own fragile trust. The future still held uncertainties, but in that moment, peace settled over her like a warm blanket. As they rose from prayer, Lydia caught Xavier watching her with a protective gentleness that made her throat tight with emotion. Whatever storms approached, she was no longer facing them alone. The January days crept past like molasses in winter. Lydia's belly grew heavier, making even simple tasks more challenging. She found herself pausing often to catch her breath, one hand pressed against the small of her back. A fierce snowstorm swept in from the north, bringing stinging winds that rattled the cabin windows. Xavier stoked the fire higher, adding extra logs to keep the bitter cold at bay. The howling wind made stepping outside impossible, trapping them indoors for 2 long nights. Rather than let the time go to waste, Xavier brought out his leather working tools and several worn harnesses that needed mending. The rich smell of leather filled the warm cabin as he spread the pieces across the kitchen table. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, holding up a needle designed for stitching leather. "It passes the time, and it's a useful skill." Lydia nodded, eager for the distraction. She settled beside him at the table, watching as his weathered hands demonstrated the proper way to hold the tools. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls as Xavier guided her fingers through the motions. "Like this," he said softly, showing her how to punch holes in the leather at even intervals. "Not too close to the edge, or it'll tear under strain." His hands were gentle as they covered hers, helping her guide the awl through the tough material. Lydia found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the work, surrounded by the crackle of the fire and the comfortable silence between them. "My father never had patience for teaching," she admitted quietly, working the waxed thread through the holes. "He'd just get angry if you didn't understand right away." Xavier's hands stilled for a moment. "Some folks mistake harshness for strength," he said. "But true strength often shows itself in gentleness." The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, Lydia felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. There was something deeply comforting about sitting beside Xavier, learning this practical craft, while the world howled beyond their walls. On the third morning, they woke to find the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a crystalline silence and drifts of pristine snow. The sun sparkled across the white landscape like scattered diamonds. "We need supplies," Xavier announced after breakfast. "The storm's passed, so we should make for town while the weather holds." Lydia's stomach tightened at the thought of facing the townspeople, but she knew they couldn't avoid it forever. Xavier helped her into the wagon, tucking warm blankets around her before climbing up himself. The wagon wheels crunched through the fresh snow as they set out. In town, people stopped to stare as they passed. Lydia heard the whispers, saw the mixture of pity and judgment in their eyes. Some women clucked their tongues, while others quickly looked away. A few kind souls offered small waves or nods, but most kept their distance. Xavier sat straight back beside her, his presence steady and protective. He didn't hurry or slouch, didn't try to hide their passage through town. His quiet dignity gave Lydia strength to hold her own head higher. At the general store, Xavier helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands careful at her waist. The bell above the door jangled as they entered, and Lydia's heart nearly stopped. There, across the room, stood her father. He wasn't alone. Two men in fine suits stood with him, their clothes marking them as outsiders. Her father's face twisted into a familiar sneer when he saw her, his eyes hard and calculating as they moved from her face to her swollen belly. Xavier stepped slightly in front of her, his broad shoulders creating a barrier between Lydia and her father's cold stare. She could see the tension in his jaw, though his movements remained calm and measured as he gathered their supplies. "Ain't you a sight?" her father's voice carried across the store, dripping with scorn. "Hiding behind your Amish protector like some scared rabbit." The suited men exchanged glances, one of them writing something in a small notebook. Lydia's hands trembled as she gripped a sack of flour, but Xavier's steady presence beside her helped her stand her ground. "We'll take these items," Xavier told the shopkeeper quietly, placing their goods on the counter. His voice was firm but peaceful, refusing to be drawn into confrontation. The ride home seemed longer, though the winter sun still hung high in the sky. Lydia couldn't shake the memory of her father's eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was something to be bartered away again. But when she glanced at Xavier, saw the determined set of his jaw as he guided the horses home, she felt something settle in her chest. This quiet man beside her, who taught her to work leather with patience and shielded her from cruelty without violence, would not abandon her to the wolves. In his own steady way, he had become her sanctuary, as solid and dependable as the earth itself. Lydia woke in the pale light of early morning, her breath catching as a sharp pain gripped her middle. She lay still, counting heartbeats, until it passed. Then another wave rolled through her like summer thunder. The baby was coming. "Xavier," she called out, her voice trembling. Heavy footsteps crossed the cabin floor, and Xavier appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his weathered face. "It's time," she managed, gripping the quilt, as another pain seized her. Xavier's eyes widened, but his voice remained steady. "I will fetch Mrs. Whitcomb straight away," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Will you be all right alone for a short while?" Lydia nodded, though fear fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. "Please hurry." Xavier paused at the door, his expression gentle. "The Lord watches over you both. I will return as quickly as I can." The sound of wagon wheels crunching through snow faded into distance, leaving Lydia alone with her mounting pain and prayers. Through the window, she watched snowflakes dance on the morning breeze, each minute stretching like molasses in January. Her hands kneaded the quilt as contractions grew stronger, her whispered prayers mixing with soft cries. The wait seemed endless, but at last, she heard the blessed sound of horses approaching. The cabin door opened, bringing a swirl of snowflakes, and the sturdy figure of Mrs. Whitcomb, her gray hair tucked beneath a wool bonnet. The midwife's experienced eyes took in everything at once as she set down her leather satchel. "Well now, young lady," she said briskly, removing her coat, "let's see about bringing this little one into the world." Her capable hands were already unpacking clean linens and various bottles of herbs. Xavier hovered nearby, his usual quiet manner tinged with worry. Mrs. Whitcomb put him to work heating water and gathering extra pillows, her calm efficiency filling the cabin with purpose rather than panic. The hours that followed tested every ounce of Lydia's strength. Pain came in waves that left her gasping, each one stronger than the last. Mrs. Whitcomb's steady voice guided her through, offering encouragement and herbal tea between contractions. To Lydia's surprise, Xavier remained close, though he kept a respectful distance. His deep voice offered scripture and gentle words of support whenever her courage faltered. "God's hand is with you," he would say, or, "You are stronger than you know." Simple words, but they gave her something to hold on to when the pain threatened to overwhelm. As morning light began to paint the eastern sky, Mrs. Whitcomb's voice grew more urgent. "The baby is coming now. Lydia, give me all your strength." Lydia bore down with everything she had, tears streaming down her face as she prayed between pushes. Xavier's voice joined with hers, asking for God's protection and mercy. Then, in one final moment of tremendous effort, the baby slipped into the world with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. Mrs. Whitcomb's weathered face broke into a broad smile as she quickly wrapped the squalling infant. "A fine boy," she announced, laying the bundle in Lydia's trembling arms. "Strong and healthy as any I've seen." Lydia gazed down at her son through tears of joy, drinking in every detail of his perfect face. His skin was the color of warm honey, his dark hair already forming tiny curls. When he opened his eyes, they were as deep and dark as the night sky. "My beautiful boy," she whispered, touching his tiny fingers with wonder. "I will love you forever, my precious one. This, I promise you." Xavier stood near the bed, his own eyes glistening as he watched mother and child. His large hands were clasped together as if in prayer, and his voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "Truly, he is a gift from God," he said softly, bowing his head. "Every child is precious in the Lord's sight." Mrs. Whitcomb busied herself with the practical tasks of cleaning and settling mother and baby, but even her businesslike manner couldn't hide her smile. "A birth is always a miracle," she said, tucking fresh blankets around Lydia and the baby. "But this one feels especially blessed." The morning sun now streamed through the window, casting a golden glow across the bed where Lydia cradled her son. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the world seemed to pause in this perfect moment of new life and fresh beginnings. Lydia's heart felt so full it might burst. Her son was here, healthy and strong. He would know love from his first breath, would grow up hearing gentle words and feeling kind hands. As she watched him drift to sleep against her chest, she offered up her own silent prayer of thanksgiving. Evening settled over the cabin like a soft blanket, bringing with it the peaceful rhythms of nightfall. Mrs. Whitcomb had departed hours ago, leaving behind instructions and a promise to return tomorrow. The wood stove crackled softly, its warmth filling the small space where Lydia rested in her bed, her newborn son sleeping contentedly at her breast. Xavier moved quietly through the cabin, preparing a light supper of broth and bread. His boots made gentle thuds against the wooden floor as he carried a bowl to Lydia's bedside. The peaceful scene shattered in an instant. The door burst open with a crash that startled the baby into frightened wails. Cold wind and snow swept in, along with 5 men whose boots thundered across the threshold. Lydia's father stood at their center, his gaunt face twisted with cruel purpose. 2 men wore rough trail clothes, guns prominent on their hips. The others were clearly railroad agents in their fine suits, though their expressions matched the hardness of their companions. "There she is," Amos growled, pointing a bony finger toward the bed. "Get up, girl, you're coming with us." Xavier stepped between them and the bed, his broad shoulders straight despite being unarmed. "Thou shalt not enter further," he said, his voice firm but calm. "The woman and child are under God's protection here." Amos sneered, the lamplight catching the gleam of whiskey on his breath. "She's my flesh and blood. I made promises to these gentlemen about that baby. There's good money waiting, an agreement signed." He jerked his head toward the railroad men, who nodded grimly. "The child has value in negotiations," one agent added smoothly. "It's a matter of business now." Lydia clutched her son tighter, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might wake him. "Please," she whispered, though whether to her father or to God, she wasn't sure. Xavier didn't move. "I cannot permit this wickedness," he said. "Leave now, and may the Lord guide you to repentance." One of the hired men stepped forward, his face shadowed under his hat brim. Without warning, he swung his fist, catching Xavier hard across the temple. The Amish man staggered but didn't fall. The second blow knocked him to the floor, where his head struck the edge of a chair. Blood began to trickle from his hairline. "No!" Lydia screamed, her baby waking again with frightened cries. "Stop hurting him." Xavier tried to rise, but another kick sent him sprawling. He lay still, blood now forming a small pool by his head. Amos stalked toward the bed, his boots leaving muddy prints on the clean floor. "Now then, girl, time to choose. Come quiet like, or we'll drag you through the snow. Your precious protector can't help you now." He gestured at Xavier's motionless form. "Railroads offering good money for that mixed blood child. Could set us all up proper." The lamp flickered as another gust of wind swept through the open door. Lydia looked down at her son's face, then at Xavier bleeding on the floor. Something shifted inside her, like ice breaking on a spring river. All her life, she'd bowed to her father's will, accepted his cruelty as her lot. But now, holding her newborn son, seeing Xavier's sacrifice, she felt strength rise up from some deep well within. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. Amos blinked, as if she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. "What did you say?" "I said no." Lydia sat straighter, cradling her child close. "I won't let you sell my baby. I won't let you hurt us anymore. You ungrateful little." Amos started forward, hand raised to strike. "Touch her." Xavier's voice came from the floor, weak but clear, "and thou wilt answer to God himself." The railroad agents exchanged uncertain glances. This scene wasn't playing out as they'd planned. One cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should." "Shut your mouth," Amos snarled, but his hand lowered slightly. He glared at Lydia, seeing something in her face he'd never noticed before, the same steel that had lived in her mother's eyes. "You'll starve out here, girl. Ain't nobody going to help you." "The Lord provides," Lydia answered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I choose his mercy over your cruelty. Now get out." For a long moment, only the wind spoke, whistling through the doorway as father and daughter locked eyes. For the first time in her life, Lydia saw uncertainty crack through her father's harsh facade. She held his gaze, silently praying for strength, clutching her newborn son like the precious gift he was. The cabin grew still as a frozen lake, waiting to see which way the ice would break. The night stretched endless, each minute dragging like an hour. Lydia knelt beside Xavier on the rough wooden floor, pressing a cloth to the wound on his temple. Her father's men had retreated to the far corner of the cabin, muttering amongst themselves about payment and promises. The railroad agents huddled near the cold hearth, their fine suits wrinkled, their confidence wavering. Amos paced by the door, taking long pulls from a whiskey flask. Each time he passed the lamp, his shadow loomed over Lydia like a dark reminder of years under his control. Outside, the winter wind moaned through the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called into the night. "Leave," Xavier whispered, his voice barely audible. "Take the little one and run while they argue." Lydia shook her head, tears falling onto his bloodied shirt. "I won't abandon you." Her baby slept against her chest, wrapped tight in a wool blanket. "You didn't abandon us." The hired men's voices grew louder, demanding payment up front. "You promised good money," one growled at Amos. "We ain't waiting till morning." "The railroad will pay," Amos snapped back, but his voice held an edge of desperation. "Just need to deliver the girl and the baby. One of the railroad agents cleared his throat. Our arrangement was predicated on a peaceful resolution. This situation complicates matters. Lydia pressed closer to Xavier as he tried to sit up. Fresh blood trickled from his temple, but his eyes remained clear and steady. "Trust in the Lord," he murmured. "He has not forsaken us." The hours crept past midnight. The lamp burned low, casting wavering shadows on the walls. Every creak of the cabin's timbers made Lydia start, wondering if more trouble approached through the darkness. Near dawn, when the eastern sky had barely begun to lighten, hoofbeats thundered through the silence. Amos rushed to the window, his face breaking into a relieved grin. About time, must be the rest of the railroad men. But as the riders emerged from the pre-dawn shadows, Lydia's heart leaped. These were not railroad men. A dozen Cheyenne warriors sat tall on their horses, their faces stern in the gray light. At their head rode Tall Elk, the chief whose son had won Lydia's heart before a soldier's bullet took him away. The chief's presence filled the doorway as he entered, his dark eyes taking in the scene. Xavier bleeding on the floor, Lydia clutching her newborn, the hired men shrinking back against the wall. When his gaze fell on Amos, it carried the weight of mountains. Word came through traders. Tall Elk spoke, his voice deep and measured. They told of a child of two peoples, and of men who would sell this new life for gold. His words, though quiet, seemed to shake the very walls. They spoke of a father, who trades his daughter's pain for whiskey. Amos, suddenly less bold without town walls to hide behind, stammered, This is family business. Private matters. The child carries the blood of my son," Tall Elk replied. "This makes it the business of our people." He gestured to his warriors, who now filled the doorway. "You speak of business, let us speak then of justice." The railroad agents exchanged glances, their earlier smoothness crumbling. One cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should reconsider our position in this matter. Perhaps you should leave," Tall Elk suggested, though his tone made it clear this was no suggestion. The hired men needed no further encouragement. They pushed past the Cheyenne warriors, hurrying into the pre-dawn light. The railroad agents followed, straightening their coats, as if trying to restore dignity to their retreat. Only Amos remained, his face twisted between fear and fury. The whiskey flask shook in his hand. "She's my daughter," he protested, but his voice wavered. "No longer," Tall Elk declared. "You sold that right for bread. Now go, before we discuss the price of your other crimes." Lydia watched as her father, the man who had ruled her world with iron and anger, seemed to shrink before the chief's steady gaze. Without another word, Amos slunk through the door, leaving only the smell of whiskey behind. Tall Elk turned to Lydia, his stern expression softening as he looked at the baby in her arms. "May I see my grandson?" With trembling hands, Lydia held out her son. The chief gently took the bundle, cradling the child with practiced ease. "He has his father's brow," he murmured, "and his mother's strength." He looked at Lydia, his eyes full of memory and hope. "You are not alone, daughter. The people of his father will know this child, will help him walk in both worlds with honor." Xavier, who had managed to sit up against the wall, spoke softly. "The boy will need all his family, all who would protect him with love, rather than use him for gain." Tall Elk nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Xavier's words. Outside, the sun began to rise, its first rays streaming through the window, warming the cabin that had seen so much darkness through the night. Inside the cabin's warmth, Tall Elk handed the baby back to Lydia with gentle care. His weathered hands, strong enough to break a man yet tender with the infant, spoke volumes about his character. The chief's dark eyes held wisdom as he settled onto a wooden chair, his presence filling the small space with quiet authority. "This child bridges two peoples." Tall Elk spoke, his words measured and clear in the morning light. "In him flows the blood of warriors and settlers. Such a gift should be treasured, not traded like cattle in the marketplace." He looked pointedly at Amos, who stood sulking by the door, his schemes unraveling before his eyes. Xavier, still leaning against the wall where he'd been struck, nodded slowly. Blood had dried on his temple, but his voice remained steady. "The Lord works in ways we cannot see. This child was meant for better than bargaining." The railroad agents shifted uncomfortably near the cold hearth, their fine suits out of place among the plain furnishings. One cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss compensation." "There will be no discussion," Tall Elk interrupted, raising his hand. The child is Cheyenne kin. We do not sell our children. Through the window, the other warriors sat tall on their horses, forming an unbroken line across Xavier's yard. Their silence spoke louder than words. They would not move until this matter was settled. Amos's face twisted with rage. You can't do this, he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. I have rights, the railroad promised. You sold your rights for bread, Tall Elk reminded him calmly. Now you would sell your grandson for gold. The spirits of our ancestors weep at such greed. Lydia cradled her son closer, feeling his warmth against her heart. The baby stirred, making small noises that seemed to fill the tense silence. She looked at her father, truly looked at him, and saw only a hollow shell of the man who had once carried her on his shoulders. Leave, father, she said softly, finding strength in her voice. Please, just go. Amos's eyes darted between the Cheyenne warriors outside and the stern face of their chief within. His hired men had already melted away like snow in spring, taking their courage with them. The railroad agents, sensing the shift in power, began edging toward the door. This isn't over, Amos growled, but his words carried no weight. With one last venomous glance at his daughter, he turned and fled, stumbling through the snow toward the woods. His footprints showed his haste, uneven and desperate, marking his path of shame. Xavier watched through the window as Amos disappeared among the trees. Then, despite his injuries, he bowed his head and spoke. Dear Lord, we thank thee for sending protection when we most needed it. Thy hand works through all peoples, and we are grateful for these unexpected allies. Tall Elk listened to the prayer with respect, then turned to Lydia. Your son will know his heritage, he promised. We will teach him our ways, our stories, our pride. He will learn to walk with honor in both worlds. Tears spilled down Lydia's cheeks as she nodded. These were not tears of fear or sorrow, but of relief, pure and cleansing. The morning sun streamed through the windows now, touching everything with gold. It caught the tears on her face, making them shine like stars. The boy will need teaching in many ways, Xavier added quietly. If you permit, I would help guide him in the English ways. In reading and farming, he should know all parts of his heritage. Tall Elk's face softened with approval. A child cannot have too many who love him. This is wisdom. He stood, his movement deliberate and dignified. We will return when the moon is full. 2. Begin sharing our stories with the little one. Until then, know that our warriors watch these lands. Your father will not trouble you again. The chief's words settled over the cabin like a warm blanket. Outside, the warriors remained steady on their horses, guardians against the morning cold. Their presence transformed Xavier's modest farmstead into a sanctuary, protected by both prayer and strength. Lydia rose carefully, her son still nestled against her. The morning light caught his small features, his father's strong brow, as Tall Elk had noted, but also something uniquely his own. A new soul, born into love despite the hatred that had surrounded his coming. As dawn brightened the sky to brilliant blue, the cabin filled with a peace that felt both ancient and new. Here, in this simple room, barriers had fallen. 3 cultures, Amish, Cheyenne, and English, had found common ground in the protection of one small life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Lydia moved slowly about the kitchen, her steps still tender from childbirth. The fresh bread she had baked filled the air with warmth and comfort. Though her arms ached, she found joy in the simple task of preparing the table for their unexpected guests. Xavier had insisted she rest, but Lydia needed this moment of normal routine after the morning's tension. Her son slept peacefully in a borrowed cradle near the wood stove, his tiny fists clenched against his chest. Every few minutes, she found herself pausing just to watch him breathe. Tall Elk and his warriors had dismounted, tending to their horses with quiet efficiency. Now they gathered around Xavier's sturdy table, their presence transforming the humble space into something remarkable. The chief laid out strips of dried venison, dark and rich, arranging them carefully on a clean cloth. The meat comes from the autumn hunt, Tall Elk explained, his voice carrying the weight of tradition. When we took these deer, we gave thanks to the Creator for providing sustenance. Xavier nodded respectfully as he set out plates and cups. His temple still showed the mark of violence, but his movements were steady. We too thank God for daily bread, he said, placing Lydia's fresh loaves on the table. The steam rose from their golden crusts, carrying the scent of home. As they settled around the table, Tall Elk began to speak of Lydia's lost love. his son flying arrow. His words painted pictures of a young warrior who had carried himself with honor, who had shown kindness to those in need. Xavier translated carefully, his German accent mixing with the chief's deeper tones as he bridged the gap between languages. "He saw you at the trading post," Tall Elk told Lydia, his eyes gentle. "He spoke of your smile for days after. When you met again by the creek, he said the Great Spirit had blessed him." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes as she listened. These were precious gifts, memories she could share with her son someday. Stories of a father who had loved truly, if briefly. "Flying Arrow defended our hunting grounds," the chief continued, his voice growing solemn. "When the soldiers came, he stood with courage. He died, protecting our people's right to live as we have always lived." Xavier translated faithfully, though his voice caught slightly at the mention of death. He understood loss too well, having buried his own beloved. As he spoke, his hand rested near, but not touching, Lydia's arm, offering quiet support. One of the younger warriors, who had been watching the sleeping baby, spoke up. Tall Elk nodded and translated himself this time. "He says the child has his father's strong brow. This is a good sign." The afternoon light grew golden as they shared the meal. Lydia watched in wonder as these proud warriors broke bread with a plain Amish farmer, their differences set aside in the name of protecting her child. They spoke of seasons and harvests, of weather signs and horse care, the common language of those who lived close to the land. Xavier listened intently to their stories, asking thoughtful questions about Cheyenne ways. His curiosity was genuine, untainted by judgment. When he didn't know a word, he would wait patiently for explanation, showing respect for the complexity of their language. As the sun began to set, painting the snow outside in shades of rose and amber, Tall Elk rose from the table. "We must ride while light remains," he said, gathering his things. "But know this, your son is Cheyenne. He will always have a place among our people." The other warriors nodded solemnly, each one pausing to look at the sleeping child before stepping outside. Their horses stamped in the snow, eager to move in the cooling air. Before mounting, Tall Elk turned back to Lydia. "When he is old enough to understand, we will teach him our ways. He will learn the stories of his father's people, the meaning of our ceremonies, the names of his ancestors." "Thank you," Lydia whispered, holding her son close. The baby stirred, opening his eyes to the fading daylight. "For everything." Xavier stood respectfully as their guests departed, his tall frame straight, despite his injuries. "You will always be welcome here," he said simply. They watched as the Cheyenne riders moved away, their shapes dark against the sunset sky. The sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into the gathering dusk. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the stove, and the baby made small contented sounds. Lydia felt the peace settle around her like a warm shawl. Here, in this simple place, she had found something she thought lost forever: safety, respect, and the promise of tomorrow. Her son would grow up knowing both the steady faith of the Amish and the proud traditions of the Cheyenne. In this moment, it seemed God's hand had guided her path through darkness into unexpected light. The days following the Cheyenne visit settled into gentle rhythms. Morning light would find Xavier in the barn despite Lydia's protests, his movements careful around his healing injuries. The bruises on his temple had faded from angry purple to softer yellows, but he still winced when reaching for hay bales. Lydia discovered an unexpected strength in herself as she took on more duties. She learned to milk the cow while balancing her son in a sling across her chest, his warm weight keeping her company. The barn cats wove between her skirts as she worked, and sometimes she caught Xavier watching her with quiet approval. In the kitchen, she experimented with herbs from Mrs. Whitcomb's garden, brewing dark teas for Xavier's bruises. "My mother taught me this blend," she explained one evening, pressing a warm cloth to his temple, willow bark and chamomile to ease the pain. The baby grew stronger each day, his cries becoming more certain. Lydia spent hours in the old rocking chair, its familiar creak keeping time with her mother's lullabies. Xavier would pause in his reading to listen, a small smile touching his lips when she sang particularly sweet passages. Their conversations, once sparse and careful, grew easier. Over supper one night, Xavier spoke of spring planting. "The south field should be good for corn," he said, breaking his bread thoughtfully, "and perhaps we could plant a kitchen garden near the house, for you and the little one." "I'd like that," Lydia answered, surprising herself with how natural it felt to plan a future here. And what of schooling, when he's older? There's a small schoolhouse, 3 miles west, Xavier said. English and Amish children learn together there. The teacher is kind-hearted. The winter wind might howl outside, but within the cabin's walls, warmth bloomed. Lydia found herself laughing more, especially when Xavier told dry-humored stories about his livestock's antics. Even his silence felt comfortable now, like a well-worn quilt wrapped around tired shoulders. The morning sun painted the fresh snow in diamonds as wagon wheels creaked up Xavier's lane. Word of Lydia's father's disgrace had spread through town like wildfire, drawing the curious to their doorstep. Mrs. Peterson from the mercantile came first, followed by the Miller's family and several others, their breaths visible in the crisp air. Lydia stood in the doorway, her son bundled warmly against her chest. Xavier's steady presence beside her gave her strength as neighbors approached. Gone was the shame that once made her duck her head. Now she met their gazes with quiet dignity. The traveling preacher, having returned from his circuit, stepped forward. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "What men intended for ill, God has turned to blessing." He raised his hands over Lydia, Xavier, and the child, offering a prayer of thanksgiving that brought tears to several onlookers' eyes. Mrs. Peterson pressed forward with a basket of fresh eggs. "We should have spoken up sooner," she admitted, her weathered face kind. "But we're here now, if you'll have our friendship." Other neighbors followed with their own offerings, jars of preserved fruit, warm bread, promises of help with spring planting. The same townsfolk who had watched silently during Lydia's darkest moment now reached out with open hands and hearts. As the sun began its descent, the visitors departed, leaving the little family in peace. Lydia settled into the rocking chair, her son drowsy at her breast. The familiar creak of wood accompanied Xavier's deep voice as he read from Psalms by lamplight. "To think," Lydia whispered, touching her baby's soft cheek, "that my father sold me for mere bread." She gazed around the warm cabin, at Xavier's gentle presence, at the gifts of friendship laid out on the table. "And instead, God gave me so much more: dignity, faith, and true family." The baby sighed contentedly, and peace settled over them like a warm blanket. Outside, stars began to twinkle in the winter sky, bearing witness to a home where love had transformed tragedy into blessing. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow, I'll bring you another story, crafted with heart.